First time Lady Charlotte Waverley understood what her marriage actually was. She was standing in the portrait gallery at Thornfield House, watching a painter add the final touches to her husband's official ducal portrait. The artist had positioned the Duke seated in the library, one hand resting on a leather-bound volume, the other hanging elegantly at his side. The background featured shelves of books, a window overlooking the estate's magnificent gardens, and slightly behind him, rendered smaller in both scale and significance, the suggestion of a figure in pale silk. Charlotte had assumed this figure would be her. She was the Duchess. She had been married to Lord Adrian Carlisle, 4th Duke of Thornfield, for nearly 3 years. Their son was 18 months old, the succession secured, her position established. She was wrong. The figure was Lady Beatrice Ashford. The painter explained this apologetically, barely meeting Charlotte's eyes. His Grace had provided specific instructions. Lady Beatrice was to be included as she served as, here he consulted his notes, the Duke's principal intellectual companion and spiritual advisor. Her presence in the portrait honored her invaluable contributions to His Grace's personal development. Charlotte stood very still. She was 25 years old, tall and slender with the kind of aristocratic bone structure that aged well, dark blonde hair that she wore simply because elaborate styles had never suited her, and gray-blue eyes that people often described as serene. She had cultivated that serenity carefully, understanding from her earliest training that displays of emotion were vulgar in women of her station. That serenity was being severely tested. Lady Beatrice Ashford was 38, a widow who had returned to England 3 years ago after her elderly husband's death in India. She was handsome rather than beautiful, possessed of the kind of strong features and compelling presence that made beauty seem irrelevant. Her hair was auburn threaded with distinguished silver. Her eyes were dark brown, intelligent and observant. Her figure was fuller than fashion strictly approved, but she wore her unfashionable body with such complete confidence that fashion seemed the one at fault. She had appeared at Thornfield 6 months after Charlotte's wedding, ostensibly visiting a cousin in the neighborhood, and had somehow never left. Adrian had been captivated immediately. Charlotte had noticed this, of course. She noticed everything, which was part of her particular curse. She noticed how her husband's face illuminated when Beatrice entered a room. She noticed how their conversations extended late into the evening in the library, whose doors were never quite closed, but never quite open. She noticed how he sought Beatrice's opinion on matters ranging from estate management to political philosophy to the proper interpretation of classical texts. She noticed that Adrian never sought her opinion on anything more substantial than menu selection. She had told herself, initially, that this was simply friendship. Men and women could be friends, particularly in their social sphere where marriages were arrangements and emotional satisfaction was often found outside marital bonds. She had told herself that she was being provincial and jealous and small-minded to find the situation troubling. She had stopped telling herself these things. The portrait made certain realities unmistakable. Adrian's official representation, the image that would hang in this gallery alongside 11 generations of his ancestors, acknowledged Beatrice's presence while rendering Charlotte completely invisible. She excused herself from the gallery with the measured grace that her deportment training had made automatic. She walked through corridors whose dimensions she had memorized across 3 years of residence. She reached her private sitting room, closed the door, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of the fury and grief that she normally kept locked away. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and began planning. Her son was the key to everything. Thomas Adrian Carlisle, Viscount Ashworth, heir to the Dukedom of Thornfield, was 18 months of perfect, oblivious childhood. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-blue eyes, and absolutely no understanding that his existence was the only thing preventing Charlotte's complete erasure from the household. English law in 1884 granted fathers nearly absolute rights over their children. If Charlotte left, Thomas would remain with Adrian. If she protested her treatment too loudly, Thomas could be removed from her care. Her access to her own child depended entirely on her continued compliance with circumstances that were slowly destroying her. This was not ignorance on the part of those who had designed such laws. This was deliberate architecture, ensuring that women like Charlotte remained trapped in situations they could not escape without losing the people they loved most. She would not lose Thomas. Therefore, she could not leave. Therefore, she required a different strategy. Charlotte began keeping detailed records. Not dramatic diary entries about her wounded feelings, but careful documentation of household management, financial decisions, estate operations, and the social obligations she fulfilled while Adrian occupied himself with Beatrice's companionship. She discovered something interesting. While Adrian was conducting extended philosophical discussions with his intellectual companion, Charlotte was actually running Thornfield. She managed the household accounts, supervised the staff, coordinated the estate's social calendar, handled correspondence with tenants, and served as the public face of the family for every function that required a duchess, but not specifically a duke. She had been doing this for 3 years without acknowledgement because the work was invisible until it stopped being done. She had no intention of making it stop, but she did intend to make certain people understood exactly who was doing it. The first opportunity arrived in autumn, when Adrian decided to host a political gathering that would bring influential members of Parliament to Thornfield for a weekend of discussion about reform legislation he supported. He announced this plan to Charlotte at breakfast, informing her that 25 guests would be arriving in 3 weeks. She asked whether he had consulted with Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, about the staffing requirements such an event would create. He had not. She asked whether he had verified that the guest chambers would be adequate, given that several had been closed for renovations. He had not. She asked whether he had considered how the political composition of his guest list might create conflicts that careful placement at dinner could mitigate or that careless placement would inflame. He had not thought about any of these things because he had assumed, correctly, that Charlotte would manage them. She smiled with the serene expression that people mistook for contentment and told him she would handle everything. She did handle everything. She handled it so well that the gathering succeeded beyond Adrian's expectations. Conversations that might have deteriorated into arguments were prevented through seating arrangements she had orchestrated with surgical precision. Guests who arrived with grievances departed as allies because Charlotte had created circumstances that encouraged connection. The weekend established Adrian's reputation as a political host whose future gatherings would be anticipated and valued. Every guest who wrote to thank him afterward mentioned the Duchess's excellent management and gracious hospitality. Adrian accepted these compliments without apparently recognizing that they referenced work he had not done and capabilities he did not possess. Charlotte began documenting everything. Each letter of thanks, each successful event, each crisis she had quietly resolved before it could damage the family's interests. She kept copies of her household accounts, demonstrating expenditure reductions she had implemented. She retained correspondence with tenants showing disputes she had mediated. She was building evidence. Evidence of what? She was not entirely certain yet. But she understood instinctively that women in her position survived through documentation, through creating records that made invisible work visible when visibility became necessary. The breaking point arrived in the spring of 1885, 4 years into her marriage. Adrian announced at dinner, with Beatrice present as she always was, that he had made a decision about Thomas's upbringing. The boy would be sent to live with Adrian's brother in Scotland beginning that summer. The Scottish air would strengthen him, and his uncle would provide masculine influence that Adrian, given his many responsibilities, could not consistently offer. Charlotte set down her fork with exceptional care. She asked, her voice perfectly level, whether Adrian had consulted her about removing their 3-year-old son from her daily care. Adrian seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. Thomas was his son and his heir. Decisions about the boy's upbringing were naturally his to make. Beatrice interjected with observations about the benefits of early independence for male children, citing educational theory that Charlotte had not requested and did not value. Charlotte excused herself from the table. She did not run, did not weep, did not provide the emotional display that would have confirmed their apparent belief that she was too delicate for serious decision-making. She went to her sitting room and wrote 3 letters. The first was to her own family's solicitor, a man named Mr. Pemberton who had managed her father's affairs and who she trusted far more than the Thornfield family lawyers. She requested immediate consultation on matters she would explain in person. The second was to Adrian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, who lived in Bath and maintained complicated relationships with her son that Charlotte had been carefully studying for 4 years. The third was to Lady Catherine Morris, a distant cousin of Charlotte's who had married well, been widowed young, and now occupied a peculiar position in society as a wealthy, independent woman whose opinions carried weight precisely because she had no husband to contradict them. She sent these letters before she could reconsider, then she waited. Mr. Pemberton arrived within a week, a small, precise man in his 60s whose unassuming appearance concealed a mind of remarkable sharpness. He listened to Charlotte's situation without interruption, occasionally making notes in handwriting so small she could barely discern it. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he asked whether she had documentation of her household management and her role in the estate's social success. She showed him everything she had been collecting. He smiled for the first time since arriving. He told her she had excellent instincts and that they would proceed carefully but with confidence. The law, he explained, gave fathers authority over children. But the law also respected the rights of mothers in ways that were evolving, particularly when mothers could demonstrate that their involvement served the child's interests and that removing them from care would constitute harm. More importantly, he continued, Adrian's position depended on reputation. A duke whose domestic situation became the subject of scandal would find his political influence diminished and his social standing compromised. If Charlotte chose to make her treatment public, the results would damage Adrian far more than they would damage her, particularly given the documentation she possessed. Charlotte absorbed this information. She asked what he was suggesting. Negotiation, he replied, from a position of strength that Adrian did not realize she occupied. The Dowager Duchess arrived the following week, her presence announced by a flurry of staff activity that suggested they feared her almost as much as they respected her. She was 71, upright and formidable, dressed in lavender silk that would have seemed frivolous on anyone else, but on her simply looked regal. She greeted Charlotte with the cool civility she always employed, then requested private conversation. In Charlotte's sitting room, with the door firmly closed, the dowager's demeanor shifted into something more direct. She had received Charlotte's letter. She had made inquiries. She had discovered what she had suspected for some time, that her son was making a fool of himself over Beatrice Ashford while neglecting his Duchess and proposing to exile his heir. She did not approve. Not, she clarified, because she possessed any particular affection for Charlotte, whose marriage to Adrian had been arranged for dynastic reasons that affection had nothing to do with, but because she possessed considerable affection for family reputation and for her grandson, and because Adrian's current course threatened both. She asked Charlotte directly what she wanted. Charlotte had prepared for this question. She wanted Thomas to remain in her care, his upbringing decided jointly by his parents rather than unilaterally by his father. She wanted acknowledgement of her role in managing Thornfield, in the form of formal authority over household decisions that she had been making informally for years. She wanted Beatrice Ashford removed from permanent residence at Thornfield. The dowager listened without expression, then she nodded slowly. She could not guarantee all of this, she said. Adrian was stubborn and believed himself in love, which made men particularly resistant to reason. But she could apply pressure that Charlotte's position did not permit her to apply. She could make clear to her son that his current path led toward consequences he would not enjoy. She would require something in exchange. Charlotte must commit to remaining in the marriage, to preserving the family's public image, to never creating scandal that would damage the Thornfield name. Charlotte agreed to these terms. She had no desire to leave anyway. She simply desired to be acknowledged within the space she occupied. Lady Catherine arrived last, bringing with her the particular power of someone who existed outside conventional restraints, and therefore could say things that others could not. She assessed the situation with the quick intelligence that had made her one of London's most sought-after dinner guests, despite her sometimes scandalous directness. Then she told Charlotte that she intended to befriend Beatrice Ashford. Charlotte must have looked alarmed because Catherine laughed and explained. The surest way to diminish someone's mystique was to know them well enough to see their flaws. Beatrice occupied her powerful position partly through remaining slightly distant, slightly mysterious, the intellectual ideal rather than the complicated reality. Catherine would eliminate the mystery. She would draw Beatrice into her own social circle, where Beatrice's obvious intelligence would be admired, but her equally obvious pretensions would be gently mocked. She would make Beatrice visible in ways that familiarity breeds, if not contempt, at least ordinariness. Charlotte listened to this strategy with growing appreciation. She had been thinking of Beatrice as an enemy to be defeated. Catherine was suggesting something more subtle, making her simply another person, no more or less significant than anyone else. The campaign that followed unfolded across 6 months, with the coordination of a military operation. The Dowager began writing to Adrian with increasing frequency, her letters filled with observations about Thomas's development and pointed questions about his father's intentions. She made clear, without direct accusation, that she was monitoring the situation and that grandmothers possessed long memories and considerable influence over family matters, including inheritances. Mr. Pemberton initiated quiet conversations with the Thornfield estate managers, making clear that the Duchess possessed her own legal counsel and her own understanding of property law, and that decisions affecting the estate might benefit from her formal consultation. Catherine invited Beatrice to a series of social events where she was, initially, the most intelligent person present, and, gradually, simply one among several intelligent women whose ideas were equally valued and equally subject to critical examination. The pedestal that isolation had provided was gently removed. Charlotte herself continued managing Thornfield with the excellence that had become her standard. But she began doing so visibly, ensuring that Adrian could not ignore who was actually handling the responsibilities he claimed. When guests complimented the household's management, she thanked them directly rather than deflecting credit. When decisions needed making, she made them and informed Adrian afterward rather than seeking permission beforehand. When Thomas needed attention, she provided it without consulting whether his father approved. She stopped being invisible through the simple expedient of refusing to hide. Adrian noticed eventually. The confrontation occurred on a Tuesday evening in the library, Beatrice conveniently absent for once, just husband and wife in a room lined with books neither of them was currently reading. Adrian wanted to know what had changed. Why was his mother suddenly involving herself in household matters? Why were the estate managers consulting Charlotte about decisions he had not authorized? Why did Thomas's nursery schedule now bypass his approval entirely? Charlotte regarded him calmly. She had been preparing for this conversation for months. She told him that nothing had changed except his awareness. She had been managing Thornfield since their marriage began. She had been raising their son since his birth. She had been fulfilling every obligation that a duchess owed to her husband's estate and family. What had changed was his notice, which she had finally decided to insist upon. Adrian attempted several responses, his confusion evident. He had not meant to undervalue her contributions. He had assumed she was content with their arrangement. He had thought she understood that his connection with Beatrice was intellectual rather than improper. Charlotte interrupted with a directness that surprised them both. She told him she no longer cared whether his connection with Beatrice was intellectual or romantic or something between. She cared that Beatrice appeared in his official portrait, while Charlotte, his actual wife and the mother of his heir, was erased. She cared that he made decisions about their son without consulting her. She cared that he had treated her as a competent manager while denying her authority, as a valuable servant while refusing her partnership. She had been the woman behind the Duke for 4 years. She would not continue in that position. Either she would be recognized as his Duchess, with all the authority and respect that position entailed, or she would make certain that everyone understood exactly who had been running Thornfield while he pursued intellectual companionship. The threat was clear, the evidence was comprehensive, the allies were positioned. Adrian was not stupid, merely self-absorbed. He understood when he had been outmaneuvered. The negotiations that followed were handled primarily through intermediaries, the Dowager on one side and Mr. Pemberton on the other, with Adrian and Charlotte maintaining careful civility while their representatives established new terms. Thomas would remain in Charlotte's care, his education planned jointly. Charlotte would have formal authority over all household management and social planning. Beatrice would maintain a residence in London rather than at Thornfield, visiting occasionally but no longer living in permanent proximity. The portrait would be repainted. Just Adrian this time, alone with his books and his window, and no pale silk figures in the background. A separate portrait would be commissioned, the Duchess with her son, to hang in equal prominence. The new arrangement was implemented gradually, Beatrice's departure handled with enough tact that gossip was minimized. She and Catherine had become genuine friends, which provided natural explanation for why Lady Ashford now spent most of her time in London within Lady Catherine's social circle. Adrian adjusted to his wife's new visibility with the awkwardness of someone learning to see what had always been present. He began, tentatively, consulting her about decisions beyond household management. He began noticing the work she did and acknowledging it, at first formally, and then with what seemed like genuine appreciation. He never loved her. Charlotte understood this and found she did not particularly mind. Love between them would have required a foundation they had never built. What they constructed instead was respect, partnership, the working relationship that many aristocratic marriages achieved when both parties stopped pretending and started negotiating. It was not romance, it was something more durable. Thomas grew into a boy who adored his mother and respected his father, and had no memory of a time when his parents' marriage had been anything other than the cordial partnership he observed daily. Charlotte raised him with the same careful attention she brought to everything, teaching him that titles came with responsibilities and that people mattered more than position. She had 4 more children across the following years, 3 daughters and another son, each born into a household where their mother's authority was unquestioned, and their father had learned, belatedly but genuinely, to value the woman he had once overlooked. Beatrice married again eventually, a professor of philosophy at Cambridge whose intellectual credentials even she could not dismiss. She and Charlotte maintained cordial relations, meeting occasionally in London, their shared past acknowledged but not dwelt upon. The Dowager lived to 93, sharp and formidable until her final weeks. Before she died, she told Charlotte privately that she had underestimated her initially, assuming her simply decorative, and that she was pleased to have been proven wrong. Coming from the Dowager, this constituted effusive praise. Charlotte lived until 1931, dying at 72, surrounded by children and grandchildren, whose lives she had shaped through her insistence on being seen. Thomas had become a reforming politician whose advocacy for women's rights in marriage and property law drew directly from his mother's experiences. Her daughters had married men who treated them as partners. Her younger son had become a physician who treated his female patients with the same seriousness he offered male ones. The portrait hung in Thornfield's gallery throughout her life and beyond, the Duchess and her son, equal in prominence to the Duke's official representation. She had been invisible for years. She had made herself impossible to ignore. She had been the woman behind the Duke. She had become the Duchess in full. And that transformation, quiet and strategic and utterly determined, was the revenge that satisfied her most completely. So now, dear audience, I turn to you with genuine curiosity. Did Charlotte's revenge satisfy you? Did you want her to destroy Adrian more completely, or was the quiet reclaiming of her position and dignity enough? What did you think of Beatrice? Was she villain, or simply another woman navigating impossible circumstances? Did the ending give you what your heart needed, or would you have written it differently? Most importantly, do you see Charlotte's strategy, the careful documentation, the alliance building, the patient visibility as something that speaks to struggles beyond 1880s aristocratic marriages? Does her quiet insistence on being seen resonate with your own experiences of being overlooked? Tell me your thoughts. Tell me your feelings. Stories live in the space between the telling and the hearing, and Charlotte's story is incomplete until you've brought your own heart to it. What did this story make you feel?